What's up, everybody? Alex Sanfilippo here, and today I want to talk to you about how to survive and thrive during your first year as a podcaster. This is really important because so many people don't make it even to the 1 year mark. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you some stats on this. I know people always talk about how podcasting is getting a little bit saturated, which is completely false. It is not true at all because, yes, there are 2.1 million shows technically on Apple. When I'm recording this, obviously, that number increases every day pretty dramatically right now. However, less than half of those are active. It's almost like 1/4. There's only 650,000 podcasts right now that are active. And Apple looks at active as the last 90 days posting an episode, which to me, that's not active. I think you could probably get away with 45 days. If you haven't posted that much time, I think you're inactive. But if I also look at episodes that are people that are actually producing consistently, there's only just over 200,000 podcasts that are consistent. That's more than 50 episodes. So consistent active podcasts are nowhere near the total amount. Now, what does this mean exactly? This means that you have less than a 10% chance of making it through your first year as a podcaster. Most people do episodes weekly, so let's just imagine 50 is your first year of your podcast. Less than 10% of people are actually going to make it that far. And I'm willing to bet it's actually substantially lower than that because there's the legacy shows that have thousands of them that kind of skew the numbers, right? So this is a very important topic for us to talk about because most people make it to what's that pod fade line. So it's like 7 episodes and then you're done. I want to be able to help people go from just that 7 that they're able to do when they have a dream that's something bigger to actually getting through their first year. So I'm going to talk about today is actually 5 things you can do to survive and thrive as a podcaster during your first or even next year of your podcast. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into these things. First off, you have to know your why for podcasting. Why are you podcasting? Now, I'll give you a couple examples of a why, air quotes there, that is not powerful enough to keep you going long term. To make money is not a good why to have. To quit your job so you can focus on this full time, that's also not a good why to have. Those things are not going to keep you going because there's many easier ways to make money and there's many easier ways to actually leave a job. You can find something else that you like that someone else can employ you with, right? Like there's a lot of things that you can do other than that. So it's not a big enough why. I always find that has to go deeper than just ourselves. It has to go into other people, to serving somebody else, to helping somebody else. You have to have a deep desire to serve the world around you. And I always find that the best podcasts are the ones that find a specific niche to do this in. So if you say, you know what, I really love the struggle these people are having, and I believe I can serve them with it. Like I know that I can help this individual. When you have that why, it makes the what you're doing, which is podcasting, a lot easier when it gets tough. So when you hit episode number 7 and mass majority of podcasts are like, I'm done, I don't want to do this anymore, you can say, no, I'm going to keep on going because my why is very powerful. I am serving this group of people. And for me, that's how I've been able to keep my show going for multiple years now. It's just remembering that, hey, even when I get overwhelmed, I can go back to my why. So that's the first thing, and I mention this every time I talk about podcasting, is you have to know that why. So for you, I recommend that you get alone, take pen and paper. So, I mean, we're used to carrying this thing around, right? Our phones, but I'm telling you, take this. Grab a notepad and a pen and sit somewhere that really just inspires you and write out that why. Why are you wanting to start a podcast, or why have you started a podcast? Get really clear on this and it's going to keep you going for a long time. So I know that's a little bit of a tangent there, but I'm going to jump ahead now. So moving on to number 2, map out your first or next 12 months. Map out your first or next 12 months. Now, what I mean by this is I don't mean have every single episode figured out that you're going to do or pre-recorded or anything like that, although you want to work ahead a little bit and have an idea of where you're going. What I mean by the first or next 12 months is today, go back to your why and think of the ideal listener that fits that criteria of your why and say, okay, this is the person that I'm going to serve with this podcast. Now, in 12 months from now, what do I want that person to have learned by hanging out with me? By listening to my podcast every week or every other week or every month or every day, whatever it might be? What do I want them to have gained or learned? Or where do I want them to be now because of what they heard from my podcast? When you can do this, this is going to help you really keep going for a long time, and mapping that out is so important. Now, I do also recommend having some key episodes figured out. So, example, for me, my podcast is to early entrepreneurs, people who are just getting started in their side hustle. And I always make sure to talk about friendship once a year. And July is Friendship Month, and there's a National Friendship Day here in the United States, which I don't even know what that means. But regardless, I make sure that I have an episode about friendship going out that day and why it matters for entrepreneurs not to forsake their friendships, even though they're busy with a full-time job and trying to make their side hustle work. So that's like just a small example of, you know what, during that 12-month period, I'm going to make sure I cover this topic. And there's a handful of other things I like to make sure that we're always covering and always getting into. So for you, make sure you map out that first or next 12 months, because what that's going to do for you, again, it's going to keep you on track. So when it gets tough, you can be like, well, No, I know that I'm already going to be helping this person get from where they are today to here, and I need to keep on going with that. So it's a really important point that I want to challenge you with. Moving on to number 3 now, build an SOP to follow for each episode. SOP stands for Standard Operating Procedure. So have some sort of standard operating procedure that you go through for every single episode you produce. Something I find that's a real problem with podcasting, especially people that are early on, is they know what needs to happen with their podcast, but it's in their head. So it's always just like, oh, I remember I need to edit that episode, or I can't remember if I did like the social post for it, or if I did this, or oh yeah, I'm supposed to be doing that as well, right? Like that's what I hear a lot of. And it's actually David Allen who said that your head is for having ideas, not for storing them. Your head is for having ideas, not for storing them. It's true. Your head is a crappy office. You don't want to have your administrative reminders be just something that's in your head that you always have to recall. The best thing you can do is just open an Excel spreadsheet, or even write it on a piece of paper on a whiteboard, everything you do for every single episode. It's so important to know everything from A to Z. So that's from finding the guest all the way through to repurposing content on social media or talking to your community about it or whatever it might be. Have this SOP, the standard operating procedure for what you do for each and every episode, and also figure out how long it takes. So have an idea of, okay, well, editing takes me about an hour. This takes me about 30 minutes. Figure all that out so you can know, it's taking me about 8.5 hours a day. That's how long it takes for me to do my podcast per week to actually produce an episode. Figure that out. Know that information. When you do, it's going to help you really set a realistic expectation for what you're capable of doing. Because some people are like, I really want to get to doing 2 podcast episodes a day. And I'll ask them, like, well, how long does it take you to produce a single episode? And they're like, oh, well, I'm not sure. And then I'm like, well, how much free time do you have? Oh, I only have 8 hours. That's all I can devote every week. Turns out it takes them 10 hours to do 1 episode. So I'm like, well, how on earth are you going to do 2 now that you've actually looked at this? So it's really important to have. Now, to actually help you out with this, I have something that I'm working on. I'll mention in a moment here. But for my show, just so you know, the way that I've been able to manage is I have 29 tasks associated. That's everything from searching for the guest, finding the guest, recording, editing, repurposing content, talking with my team, like all those things. There's 2 of us that work on my show, and it takes about 8.5 hours for every single episode we produce. Now, I know this down to a T, and we've actually been able to build something, as I was just mentioning, a software to help keep this organized for other podcasters. So if you're interested in this, just go to podcastsop.com, and you can get a free trial and check it out and see if it's something that would work for you. But I just wanted to develop this because for me, I was struggling to keep it organized. Again, using my head way too much. So this is something we came up with to serve podcasters. So again, podcastsop.com, check that out. But anyway, now back on track here. So now moving on to number 4 here. This is a really important one. You need to automate, delegate, and eliminate everything that you can. Automate, delegate, and eliminate everything that you can. Now, what I mean by this is when we're getting started in podcasting, I was super guilty of this. I looked at some like the big names in podcasting, and I was seeing what they were doing. So, which is a good strategy, right? Figure out what the people that you really admire are doing with their show. So I was looking at them like, okay, they got a really big YouTube channel, and they've got they're doing Instagram Reels. They've got TikTok. Oh, great. I don't even know how to use that, right? Like we're looking at all these things that people are doing and saying, okay, if I'm going to launch successfully, I need to do these things. And you might be listening to this right now or watching this and saying, yeah, Alex, that sounds right. That's what you have to do. But it's actually counterproductive, and it's not actually the case. These people that we look at that are doing all these things have started those things over time and brought them on and into their SOP, their standard operating procedure, over time. They didn't start with those. If you want to start a podcast, not a YouTube channel, not a Clubhouse account, not all the other things that you can do alongside it. You have to figure out what the main thing is going to be and start from there. When you get good at it, when you master it, when you feel like, okay, I'm comfortable with this, add one thing at a time. Something I noticed that too many podcasters do, especially when they're getting started, and me being guilty of this, we feel like we need all of the things right when we launch, and we just spread ourselves so thin that we can't even do a good job with the podcast because it's like, well, I got to hurry up and finish the podcast because I got to post it in 30 different places. I got to get the website up. I got to do this. Got to get the community going. You don't need to do any of those things. What I recommend doing is just starting with the most important thing, and the most important thing is the podcast, right? You started a podcast to be a podcaster, not to be a TikTok star, right? So make sure that you have your head in the right place about what you're doing, and it's going to help you be set up for long-term success. So when you think about automating, think about any task you're doing with your podcast and just say, okay, this is taking me a lot of time. I don't enjoy it. Is there any sort of tool out there for automation? Now, here's a little hack for you. Most things that you're going to use for your podcast are going to be free. I use a lot of automation tools that are completely free, and I'm not opposed to paying for stuff, but there's just so many free tools out there in today's world, and you can find ways to automate almost anything that you're doing. So look at that. Be like, okay, first off, what can I automate to take some things off my plate? Next, think about delegation. Okay, these can't be automated, but I really don't like editing. Let's just imagine. I personally actually really enjoy editing, but a lot of people say that's their least favorite part. So can you find somebody, can you find a VA or something like that? And I can make recommendations if you need anything like that, to have somebody say, hey, can you do the editing portion for me? Can I delegate this to you? And the last thing is to eliminate. Now, I just went through like kind of a rant about all the things that we think we need to do with podcasting. If you've already bitten off more than you can chew and you're already doing all these things, figuring out what you can eliminate. What is someone else doing that's really pushing them toward their success that's not doing the same thing for you? Here's an example that I don't really care for social media too much, which I know is like blasphemy in the years that we live in now, but I'm just not a huge fan of it. And I especially hate Facebook and Instagram. I just don't like it at all. I feel like most of it's vanity, for me at least. And when I started my podcast, I thought I needed to really grow everything on Instagram because that's where my listeners were going to come from. Well, guess what I was able to do? I was able to actually figure out through looking at analytics that most of my listeners were coming through LinkedIn, which is my favorite of my favorite of my least favorite social media, right? Like it's the one I hate the least, if you will. And I realized all my listenership was coming through that. So what I did is I just eliminated Instagram from my strategy. And most people have told me, like, Alex, that's a terrible idea. Well, guess what? My podcast has grown faster than ever before, and I'm working hours less every single day. So people can be telling me all day that that was a bad decision, but guess what? It wasn't a bad decision. It was a great decision. Remember, your success is going to be your success, not somebody else's. So sometimes you have to make that decision to remove something that other people are telling you not to because you know it's the right thing. Hone in on what matters, where the traffic is coming from, and really add your time there. It goes back to the old 80-20 rule, which the 80-20 rule just simply says that what I'm doing with 20% of my time is driving 80% of the results. Your job is to figure out what that 20% is and focus there as much as you possibly can to see some exponential results. So again, automate, delegate, and eliminate everything that you possibly can with your podcast so you can stay focused, keeping the main thing the main thing. All right, moving on to my final point here. Number 5, connect with your listeners. This helps you refine your avatar. Now, your avatar is that most ideal listener, and I have more resources on this if you're interested. Again, just feel free to reach out at any point. I would happily help you with that. But the idea is you can't really know who's listening to your podcast or what they want without actually connecting with them. Something we do in the podcasting space is we guess a lot. We assume many things. We figure this is what people like and what they don't like. So what I've come up with is actually a list of 4 questions. So these are 4 questions that I want you to ask your listeners. And now I call this doing things that won't scale because I don't want you sending out in a mass email. I don't want you to post it on social media. I want you, anytime somebody messages you or emails you about your podcast saying, hey, I really enjoyed it, ask them for a call. So you can get on a phone call with them or jump on Zoom or anything like that, whatever they're willing to do to ask them these 4 questions I'm about to run you through, because this will help you really refine that avatar and it helps you really build that strong community around your listeners because people are like, wow, this person is real. They're willing to actually talk to me. So here's those 4 questions and they're super important. And I want to make sure that you really understand these, write these down. And this is, again, doing things that won't scale. Like you won't always be able to do this, but initially this is so, so important. So here's those 4 questions. Number 1, how did you hear about my podcast? Again, we all assume that people found us through Apple or they heard us on Clubhouse or wherever it might be, right? Like we all have these assumptions as like, this is how they found me. But you'll find when you ask this question that you're probably wrong. There may actually have been somebody who wrote a blog post about your podcast or they talked about you on their show. And that's where people are coming from. And when you can learn these things, you can hone in on that again and capitalize on it and find a way to do more of those type of things. So you want to ask first and foremost, how did you hear about my podcast? And don't assume that you know the answer to this. Number 2, next thing here, what do you like about my show? So what do you like about what you hear with my show, Creating a Brand? What do you like about it? Like what stands out to you? Again, we make great assumptions that, it's the audio quality. It's so good. Or I ask great questions. When on the other hand, my people might be like, wow, your guests are so funny. And you might hear that from a lot of people and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm bringing on funny guests. I didn't even realize it. Or something like that, right? Like that might not be it. But what's really important is you find out what people like about the show. So again, you can capitalize on that. And the next question goes right into this. This is the toughest question that everyone wants to skip. Do not skip this question because if you skip this question, it's going to hurt you in the long run. What don't you like about my show? What don't you like about it? This is so important because, and again, it's scary to ask and you want people to give candid feedback. And yeah, your podcast is your baby, but you can't get offended here. You have to be okay with hearing things that people don't like about it because that's what helps you improve. So when someone says, oh, I really like this about your show, ask them, well, what do you not like about it? You might hear, you know what, I think it's just a little bit long. Or, you know what, your intro segment is just like too much. It's too loud or this, right? Again, don't get offended. Don't get upset. This is going to help you because if you hear this over and over again from people that you're talking to, when you're doing these things that won't scale, when you're connecting with your listener, when you do these things, you're going to find answers that that are really going to help you be able to tweak and adjust and improve your show over time. When I did this early on, I asked as many people as I could these questions. And yeah, it hurt a little bit, but you know what? I made adjustments, and now some of those people are my most loyal fans. They share my podcast more than anyone else does because they're like, man, this guy listens. He's improved his show continuously. You're going to love following what Alex is doing. So again, get comfortable with being uncomfortable and ask this question: what don't you like about my show? Number 4, the final one here. What is your biggest struggle right now? What is your biggest struggle right now? Now, this question seems a little different than the other ones, right? The other 3 were directly connected to the podcast. This one, not so much. But everyone wants to talk about podcast monetization. And the assumption is I'm going to get a ton of listeners, I'm going to do ads or get a sponsor, and I'm going to be doing fantastic. It's just not realistic. And I don't mean to sound negative, but there are very, very, very few people, less than 1% of all podcasters, that actually ever get to that point where that's enough to live off of. And it's probably less than 1%. It's probably 0.1% is the reality of it. But regardless, by asking this question, and if you can pinpoint some commonalities among your listeners where they all say, yeah, I'm really struggling with this, and I like your podcast because it helps me understand it a little bit better. If you can find a common problem that your listeners have and you can solve that problem for them, you just built something that you can monetize very, very easily. As a matter of fact, that's how I launched Podmatch, which is now a company that brings in 6 figures a year. I did that because I was asking my audience, what is your biggest struggle right now? And I heard the commonality. Instead of trusting myself, trying to come up with all these crazy ideas, because my ideas aren't that great, I listened and built a solution off of a problem that the people that were already listening to me had. And when you can do this and you can understand your avatar really well and what unique problem you solve for them, you can begin to monetize in a big way that's not just going to bring you money, because that's great and all, but it's actually going to be led with value because you're solving problems for people that you've already said you care about. Going back to number 1, where we talked about your why. If your why is to serve these people and now you're actually solving their problems, making money in the process, you just hit a gold mine. That is a fulfilled life that you can live, and your podcast can be the vehicle to help you get there. So really make sure that you ask this question, write the answer down to these 4 questions, like make sure you really understand them and dive deep on this, and it's really going to help you out in the long run. So again, make sure that you're thinking about, hey, what problem can I solve for these people? What are they struggling with? What can I do to serve them, and get creative with that? So these are my points here. I know this was a lot to cover here, but this is how you can survive and thrive during your first year as a podcaster or your next year. You can do this at any point, and it is going to help you out. So again, my name is Alex Sanfilippo. If there's ever anything I can do to help, feel free to reach out. I'd love to connect with you, but I am looking forward to following your podcasting journey. So be sure to connect with me somewhere. And again, I'm looking forward to seeing you survive and thrive during your first year as a podcaster. Thanks so much for watching, everybody.